Thank you, Sumant, and a very good evening to you, all of you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here to what is an extraordinary, beautiful island with which I have another association, as you know, um, and to speak about a topic which is very close to my heart. Now, as many of you are aware, India is at a particular turning point in its history. We have emerged out of the COVID crisis in reasonably good shape. We are now, by some margin, the world's fastest growing economy on a sustained basis for the last 3 years, and by most accounts, except for some major mishap, possibly for the next couple of years at least. As a result of this, we have emerged as the world's fifth largest economy in US dollar terms, at about $4 trillion, just short of $4 trillion in 2023. But at the current growth pace, we will probably go past Germany in about 18 months' time to become the world's fourth largest economy, and another 18 months after that go past Japan to become the world's third largest economy. So in about 36 months' time, we will be the world's third largest economy. In fact, in purchasing power terms, we already are the world's third largest economy. However, even at that point, we will be, on a per capita basis, quite a poor country. We may be the world's third largest economy at that point, but do remember we are the world's largest population. And in order to become a developed country, and even to get to the bottom of the rung on the developed country stairway, we will need to keep sustaining this for another quarter of a century, what our Prime Minister calls Amrit Kal. So this is not about getting next year's growth done or the year after that's growth done. This is about sustaining 25 years of sustained high growth, which means it entails 25 years of continuous investment into business, into infrastructure, and so on. And of course, a significant proportion of that will go wrong. There's no country in the world which hasn't gone through this process. Sometimes that breakdown from a lot of this investment going wrong happens early in the cycle, as happened indeed in the Southeast Asia with the Asian crisis. In some cases, it keeps going for a long time, as happened in Japan till it all broke down in the 90s. Perhaps something similar is happening to the Chinese right now. So it's an important part of the game for sustaining over long periods of time to be able to liquefy the mistakes along the way, which is what insolvency and bankruptcy is about. So it is absolutely critical to our economic model that the insolvency and bankruptcy process works. I mean, we could get lucky like Japan that this accumulation of bad bets happens at the end, but we could get unlucky and it happens in the beginning, as happened with Southeast Asia. So this is an important thing for us. And indeed, this issue of insolvency and bankruptcy has already played itself out as an important part of our current economic performance. And there are several people here who are an important part of this story, not the least Dr. Sahu, former Deputy Governor Vishwanathan, and of course Sumant himself. So let me tell you a bit of a story, because they were important parts of this story as well, of how the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which we came up with in 2016, so not very long ago, has already played a very important role in India's economic journey. To understand this, you need to go back a little bit more than a decade to the phase just after the global financial crisis of 2007-8. While we were not at the core of that crisis, we did get impacted like most other countries in the world, and growth suddenly slowed down. The response of the government and the authorities of that time was to open up the gates for bank credit. And so there was a phase of very rapid bank credit growth and investment that happened from the year 2007, 8, 9, 10 up to about 12. On the positive side, it revived growth faster than would have otherwise been the case. But it was quite obvious by 2014 that a very significant part of this was going wrong. And it was also beginning to generate other macroeconomic problems. Higher inflation, the current account was getting blown up, and there were many other issues. The exchange rate was under pressure and so on. And of course, the banking system was beginning to get stressed. In fact, the IMF then classified us as one of the fragile 5 economies in the world. And so there was a fair amount of concern about, if you went back 10 years ago, there wasn't all that much, optimism about India. And, there were many naysayers who would have said, look, yet again, India was going to kind of not keep up with its promise. So that's when the government changed and so on. But this problem with the banks and the non-performing assets that were accumulating in it continued. And it would keep going up till at its peak, it would gross non-performing assets of the banking system would go up to as high as 11%. For the public sector banks, it would peak at 14%. So you can imagine this is almost life-threatening levels of non-performing assets. So now, this issue, as you can imagine, was a very hot topic at the top of the mind when I first joined government in almost exactly 7 years ago, in the beginning of 2017. And since I used to work for Deutsche Bank before I joined government, so since I came from the finance kind of background, the then finance minister, Minister Arun Jaitley, who was my boss, called me pretty much on my first meeting and said, look, you're the only guy with some banking background in this team. It's your job to figure this out. Now, the received wisdom at that time in the finance ministry was to take all this bad stuff out of the banking system and to put it into some sort of a bad bank. Now, there were people who were not quite happy about this. Dr. Sahu was one of them. I think the Reserve Bank was also not terribly pleased with this idea. But in the finance ministry, which was what ultimately would call the shots, this was the received wisdom that, look, this is what ultimately the Southeast Asian countries did. This is what America did in various ways. So there were various versions of these bad banks. But basically, some sort of a bad bank, put all the bad stuff into it. They can resolve it. At least the banks will get on with the lending part of things. Now, I was, however, not terribly keen on this because of India's own experience with a sort of bad bank. We used to have, I think starting from not the late 80s or early 90s, a body called BIFR. Now, BIFR was basically a warehouse where insolvent companies went to not quite die, but live their lives out in a sort of half-dead kind of way. They would not be allowed to die because taxpayers' money would be put in to keep them sort of alive. But they would not be allowed to revive because obviously nobody had that much, the taxpayers' money wouldn't go in. And you had huge amounts of these economic assets that were kind of lying around half dead in this warehouse. So I was quite certain that if we created a bad bank, we would effectively create another BIFR. Now that's all good, good to say no to something, but then what do you do? So I decided to look into this issue a little deeper, and this is the time in which I got to know Dr. Sahu as well and Suman. And I dug in and discovered something quite unique about our NPA problem, which was that 50 cases accounted for almost 70% of the problem. And in fact, there were 12 cases that accounted for 28% of the NPA problem. Since many of you know my penchant for colorful terms, I dubbed them the dirty dozen. And so I went back to Finance Minister Jaitley and said, why don't we take this through this new law we have called the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code? So he considered the matter, but there was one issue, of course, that this IBC process had never been tried before. So there were some people who still thought that, and the then chief economic advisor, my colleague, who was very much in favor of the bad bank idea, he said, look, this has never been tried again. Would you first at least try out a small company or something through the process to see if it works at all? But I said, look, the complicatedness of a case is uncorrelated to its size. And in fact, most of these cases were in fact rather simple cases. Even though they were large cases, they were simple cases. And if we wanted to test out the insolvency system, can you hear me? Yeah? Yeah, good. I'm a loudmouth. The mic is still working, yeah. So even then, if, why not test out the IBC process with the big cases? But so I took this idea to the then banking secretary, Anjali Dugal. I'm mentioning all these people because they were an important part of this story and they shouldn't be forgotten. Their contribution shouldn't be forgotten. And I also took it to the Reserve Bank. There was a deputy governor called Veera Lacharya, with whom I very publicly disagreed on monetary policy. But on the issue of using the IBC to clean up the banks, we worked very closely together. So with both Secretary Dugal and Deputy Governor Acharya, we met together and we thought this was a good idea. So we went back to Jaitley and said, let's use this particular thing. We'll take first 12 largest companies through this process, and then we'll take the other 50 and the remaining, 38 through the system as well. Now, of course, I wasn't 100% sure it would work, but Dr. Sahu was quite confident that it would function. So with that, and with advice from Sumant, we took these 12 largest companies through the process. And it worked. But most importantly, in fact, even better than I anticipated, it changed the culture that used to exist in India. And those of you who are from India will remember this, that there was this presumption many large defaulters had that, repayment was optional. And so very suddenly and very quickly that attitude changed. And it wasn't just the other 38 of that top 50, but many other hundreds of people suddenly began to repay their debts. And suddenly the banks began to get a lot of money back. And you know this story because it came out in the newspapers and so on. And the NPA levels began to fall rather faster than anybody had anticipated. Till in last year, in the last count, the NPA levels have now declined to something like 3.2% of the banking sector's assets on a gross basis. They're also well provisioned, so on a net basis, I believe they are below 1%, something like 0.9 or something, and falling quite fast. So we have gone from a banking system that nearly went bust to one that is in rude health. But we did it in nick of time, because if we had gone into the COVID crisis, which happened in 2020, with the banking system we had in 2017, let me say we would have had a major economic meltdown. So thankfully, through 18 and 19, we managed to get enough of the banking system back on the rail. And in fact, even through the COVID crisis, interestingly, the bank's health kept improving, ironically, because creditor rights had been re-established after generations. And so the point I'm making is that insolvency and bankruptcy has, and this new process, new as it may be, has already played a very important role in the current strength of the Indian economy. And we really understand this well. And so this process, yeah, there are wrinkles that get added, new things, new problems arise. But let me assure you that from the government's perspective, we take this insolvency and bankruptcy process very, very seriously. It is this government that brought it in, this government that used it to clean up the banks very successfully. And we intend to, whatever new problems may arise, we intend to work with you closely and iron those out. Because as I said, This is not just about today or the next year or the next to next year. This is about keeping this machine going for at least 25 years. So with that, let me stop, and maybe we can have a more panel discussion where we can talk about history and other broader issues.